There's a particular kind of tired that doesn't go away with sleep, and I had it for about 4 years before I ever set foot in Phuket. Not the tiredness of hard work. I'd done 30 years on construction sites and knew that kind well enough. The ache in the knees, the early nights. This was different. This was the tiredness of a marriage ending in slow motion, the kind where you're still legally married for 2 more years after you've already, privately, said goodbye. By the time my decree absolute actually arrived in the post, I didn't feel devastated. I felt like someone had finally switched off a machine that had been humming in the next room for half a decade. That's the part nobody warns you about. Nobody tells you that the end of something painful can feel less like grief and more like a held breath finally let out. I was 60 when I landed at Phuket International, and I'd been a site manager for the better part of 3 decades before that, mostly commercial builds around the Midlands. The kind of job where you spend your whole career making sure other people's structures don't fall down, while your own life quietly does. Redundancy came 2 years before the divorce finalized, a decent enough package. And between that and what was left after the settlement, I arrived in Thailand with £290,000 to my name, and a version of a plan that, looking back, wasn't really a plan at all. It was more like a belief, dressed up as a plan. I believed, without ever quite saying it out loud to myself, that if I simply moved far enough away from the house, the solicitor's letters, the mutual friends who'd quietly picked sides, some new version of me would be waiting on the other side of the flight, already assembled, already fine. The marriage itself had ended the way I understand a lot of marriages end after 30 years, not with some single catastrophic betrayal, but with a slow accumulation of separate rooms, separate evenings, separate silences at the dinner table that neither of us had the energy left to fill. My wife, Susan, wasn't unkind in the ending of it, and I want to be fair to her here, because I think it would be easy to tell this story as though she were simply the first casualty of a pattern rather than a person I genuinely loved for most of my adult life. We simply stopped being able to find each other somewhere around the time our youngest left for university. And the 2 years the divorce actually took to finalize, once we'd both admitted that out loud, felt less like a fight and more like a long, exhausting piece of administration neither of us had the stomach for. I want to be honest about that belief, because I think it's the whole engine of what happened next. I'd heard people talk about geographic cures before. My brother-in-law used the phrase once, dismissively, about someone else entirely, and I'd nodded along at the time without registering that I was about to become the textbook case of exactly that. I told myself Phuket wasn't running away. I told myself it was starting again. I even said that phrase to my daughter on the phone the week before I flew out, starting again, and she went quiet in a way that I understand now, and didn't understand then, was her trying to work out whether to say something and deciding, out of love, not to. The island did what islands do to a certain kind of Englishman in his 60s. It made every ordinary thing feel slightly cinematic. The heat on my skin the first morning, the noise of the scooters, the smell of something frying 2 streets over that I never identified and never stopped noticing. I rented a small apartment a short walk back from Patong beach, close enough to hear the evening noise without being swallowed by it. And for the first fortnight, I did almost nothing except walk, eat, and sleep, better than I had in years. I remember thinking, quite consciously, that the plan was working, whatever the plan actually was. I felt, for the first time since before the marriage properly soured, something close to lightness. I met her at the guest house 2 doors down from my apartment block, where I'd taken to having breakfast most mornings, because the coffee was better than anything I could make in my own kitchen. Her name was Pornthip. She worked the reception desk, and she was 26, which I want to address directly rather than skate past, because I think skating past it is part of how men my age let themselves off the hook too easily. I noticed the age gap. I noticed it and set it aside, the way you set aside a splinter that isn't quite bothering you yet. And I told myself that loneliness doesn't check passports, that connection is connection, and that a man who'd spent 30 years building things other people would live in for decades was entitled to build something for himself for once, on his own terms, without asking anyone's permission. She was easy to talk to in the particular way that felt, at the time, like a relief rather than a warning. I'd spent the last years of my marriage having conversations that were really just two people rehearsing old arguments in slightly different words, and here was someone who asked me about the actual texture of my life, what a construction site actually smelled like at 7 in the morning, whether I missed the noise of it, whether I'd ever built something I was proud of. Small questions, but nobody had asked me anything like them in years. I don't think it's naive to say that attention, real or performed, is one of the most disarming things a lonely man can be offered. I only understood, much later, how much of what I took for genuine curiosity might have simply been good listening deployed with purpose. Within 6 weeks, we were seeing each other most days, and within 10, she had, at my suggestion rather than hers, moved a few things into my apartment, though she kept her own room at her sister's for what she called appearances, a phrase I found charmingly old-fashioned at the time, and didn't examine any further than that. I want to be fair here and say she never once, in those early weeks, asked me for money, not for anything. If someone had asked me, that second month, whether I was worried about being taken advantage of, I would have laughed, genuinely, and pointed to that exact fact as my evidence. She doesn't want anything from me, I remember telling a fellow expat at a bar one evening, with something close to pride, as though the absence of a request was proof of the absence of an intention. It was that same fellow expat, a Yorkshireman named Ian, who'd been on the island the better part of a decade and had clearly seen a few versions of my story play out before, who tried, gently, to slow me down. We were a few beers into an evening at a bar just off the main strip, and he asked me, in the roundabout way Englishmen ask uncomfortable questions, whether I'd thought about keeping my finances separate for a good long while yet, whatever happened between us. I remember bristling slightly, the way you do when someone questions a decision you haven't technically made yet but have already emotionally committed to. I told him my situation was different, that I wasn't buying property, wasn't handing over lump sums, that I was simply a 60-year-old man enjoying female company after 5 miserable years of not having any. He didn't push it. He just said, in that flat Yorkshire way of his, that he'd heard a version of "my situation is different" from every single Englishman he'd ever watched lose his shirt on this island, and left it there. I remember being irritated with him for most of the walk home, and I remember, with the particular clarity hindsight provides, that irritation is usually the sound truth makes when you're not ready to hear it yet. Ian told me something else that evening that I didn't think much of at the time, and have thought about a great deal since. He said that in his experience, the men who got into the most trouble on the island weren't the reckless ones, the ones throwing money at property deals within a fortnight of arriving. Those men, he said, at least had their guard up somewhere, even if it was in the wrong place. The men who really came unstuck, he said, were the tired ones. Divorced men, widowers, men who'd just retired from careers that had defined them. Men who arrived already worn down and mistook the first bit of warmth they encountered for something earned rather than something offered. I asked him, half joking, which category he thought I fell into, and he didn't answer straight away, which I think was its own kind of answer. The joint account was my idea, not hers, and I want to be completely honest about that because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. 2 months in, we were effectively living together, and I found it faintly ridiculous. A man of 60, forever transferring small amounts of cash by hand for groceries and electricity bills like some teenager splitting a takeaway. I suggested opening a joint account purely as a practical measure, something to cover shared household costs without the daily fumbling, and she was, if anything, mildly reluctant at first, which I remember registering at the time as a kind of humility on her part, an unwillingness to seem like she wanted access to my money. I opened it myself, at a bank branch on the road toward Kalim, transferred in what felt like a sensible working float, and thought no more about it beyond a faint, private pride at how sensibly I was managing my new life. For the first few months, the account behaved exactly as I'd expected it to. Small withdrawals, groceries, the odd meal out, nothing that troubled me in the slightest, nothing that stood out against the ordinary rhythm of 2 people sharing a life. If anything, I remember feeling reassured by how unremarkable it all was. This, I told myself, is what a functioning relationship looks like. Shared costs, shared life. Nothing dramatic. I want to flag, because I think it's an honest and useful thing to say to anyone listening to this who's in a similar position, that the danger was never in any single withdrawal. It was in how completely unremarkable each one felt, one after another, until unremarkable had quietly become the water I was swimming in, without ever noticing the current. I didn't check that account often, which I recognize now as its own kind of admission. I'd spent 30 years checking site drawings, checking measurements, checking everything twice because a mistake on a construction site costs more than pride. And yet here, in the one area of my life where a mistake was compounding daily, I simply didn't look, because looking felt like the kind of suspicion I'd promised myself I was done with after the divorce. I'd left a marriage full of quiet suspicion and cross-examination, and some part of me had decided, consciously, that my new life would be built on trust instead. Without quite working out that trust, without any verification at all, isn't really trust. It's just hope wearing trust's clothes. Around the 4th month, I noticed her spending more time at her sister's, evenings mostly, and when I asked, lightly, whether everything was all right, she'd say her sister needed help with something or other, a phrase vague enough that I never felt entitled to push further. I noticed, too, a new phone appear one week, a nicer model than the one she'd had before, and when I asked about it, she mentioned an upgrade deal through her provider, and I remember thinking, at the time, that it wasn't my business to interrogate every purchase a grown woman made with what I assumed, wrongly, was mostly her own money from the guest house job. I want to be honest that none of these things on their own felt like anything. It was only much later, doing the arithmetic properly for the first time, that I understood how many small, unremarkable things had been quietly stacking on top of each other the entire time. The evening everything actually changed started as one of the most ordinary evenings of that entire period. I'd gone to withdraw cash for a dinner reservation I'd booked to mark our 6th month together, walked to the ATM on the main road the way I had dozens of times before, tapped in the card, and watched the screen return an error I didn't immediately understand. I tried again, assuming a network fault, the kind of glitch that happens on every island with patchy connectivity. And the second attempt returned a balance inquiry instead, which I hadn't even asked for, as though the machine itself wanted me to see something before I asked. The number on the screen was 412 baht. 412. Not 412,000, 412 baht, which at the exchange rate that month came to roughly £9. I stood at that machine for what felt like a very long time, doing the thing I imagine everyone does in that moment, which is press the button again, as though the machine might apologize and correct itself on a 3rd attempt. I want to try to describe what I actually felt in that moment, because it wasn't what I expected, and I think the honesty of it matters more than the drama of it. I did not feel shocked, not really. What I felt, standing there under the buzzing light of that ATM vestibule with mopeds passing behind me, was something closer to a terrible, quiet recognition, as though some part of me had been expecting this exact screen for months, and simply hadn't been willing to say so out loud. I walked back to the apartment that night and pulled up the account on my phone properly for the first time in longer than I care to admit, and sat on the edge of the bed scrolling through months of transaction history I'd simply never bothered to read, watching the small, unremarkable withdrawals stack up into a total that, added together, came to just under £206,000, once every baht transfer was converted at the rate it had gone out at. I confronted her the next morning, and I want to say plainly that there was no scene, no shouting, nothing that would make for dramatic footage if anyone had been filming it. I asked her, simply, where the money had gone, and she didn't deny that it was gone, which I suppose I should credit her for. What she offered instead was a loose, shifting account of family costs, her sister's shop needing stock, an uncle's medical bill, expenses that individually sounded plausible and collectively didn't add up to anything I could properly verify, because I had never once, in 6 months, asked to see a single receipt for any of it. When I asked why she hadn't simply told me the money was going toward her family rather than letting me discover it by accident at a cash machine, she told me I wouldn't have understood, that this was simply how families worked here, and that I was making something ordinary sound like a crime. I asked her, at one point, whether any of what had happened between us over those 6 months had been real, and she looked at me with an expression that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite guilt, something closer to weary impatience, as though I were asking her to solve an equation she considered beneath her. "You don't understand how hard it is here," she said, which I noted, even in that moment, was not actually an answer to the question I'd asked. I didn't push further. I think some part of me already understood that I wasn't going to get an answer that would satisfy the part of me still hoping, foolishly, that this had all meant something beyond the numbers. I sat with that answer for a long time after she left the apartment that afternoon, and what I felt, more than anger, more than grief, was an exhaustion so complete it was almost peaceful. I want to describe that feeling honestly, because I think it's the part of this story most people wouldn't expect. I did not collapse. I did not rage. I felt, instead, the specific and almost restful sensation of a thing you'd half known for months finally being allowed to be true. It was the same feeling, I realized, as the day my decree absolute had arrived in the post. Not devastation, but the quiet, bone-deep relief of a held breath finally being let out. I had spent 5 years bracing for one ending, and here, on the other side of the world, in a life I'd built specifically to escape that feeling, I was bracing for another one almost identical in shape, and some worn-out part of me was simply, finally, glad it was over, rather than still ongoing. Ian, when I told him a few days later over the same bar stools where he'd first tried to warn me, didn't say "I told you so." Not directly, though I could see him choosing not to. What he said instead was that he'd watched at least 4 other men go through some version of this over his years on the island. Joint accounts drained slowly enough that nobody ever quite caught it in the act, and that the men who recovered fastest were the ones who stopped trying to work out exactly how much of what they'd felt had been real. I asked him how you were supposed to do that, and he said, honestly, that he didn't know, that he'd never fully managed it himself about his own version of the story, and that the honesty of that answer, oddly, helped more than false reassurance would have. I saw a solicitor in Phuket town within the week, a careful, unhurried man who explained to me, patiently, that recovering money from a joint account, once withdrawn and spent, was rarely straightforward anywhere in the world, let alone across a jurisdiction I didn't fully understand, and hadn't taken the basic precaution of getting independent advice on before opening the account in the first place. He asked me, gently, whether I had kept any record of what the account had originally been intended for, any written understanding between the two of us about how it should be used, and I had to admit that there had never been anything beyond a verbal, faintly embarrassed conversation about splitting grocery costs. He didn't say it was hopeless. He said it would be difficult, expensive to pursue meaningfully, and unlikely to return more than a fraction of what was gone even in the best outcome. And I remember appreciating, even in the moment, that he hadn't dressed that up in false optimism just to keep me as a paying client. I remember sitting in his office doing the arithmetic on the back of an old site notebook I still carried out of habit, because old habits from 30 years on construction sites don't leave you just because the ground under you has changed. 290,000 pounds arrived with me. 206,000 of it was gone. 84,000 remained, most of it never having touched the joint account at all, sitting untouched in the original UK account I'd never quite gotten around to closing. And I remember feeling absurdly grateful for my own laziness, the one piece of procrastination in this entire story that had actually saved me something. I did not stay on the island much longer after that, not out of drama, and not because I couldn't have afforded to, technically, on what remained, but because I understood, with a clarity I hadn't expected to arrive so calmly, that I had come to Phuket carrying an old exhaustion I'd never actually dealt with, and that no beach, no new relationship, no fresh start dressed up as geography was ever going to do the dealing with it for me. I packed up the apartment over a single weekend, gave away more than I shipped, and remember standing at the departure gate at Phuket International thinking, quite plainly, that I felt lighter leaving than I had arriving, which struck me even then as a strange thing to feel about a place that had just cost me over 200,000 pounds. I am back in the Midlands now, living in a modest rented flat near my daughter, doing occasional consulting work for a former colleague's construction firm, enough to keep busy without needing to prove anything to anyone. I am 61. My daughter picked me up from the airport herself, and I remember the drive home being almost entirely silent. Not out of tension, but because there wasn't much left to say that the silence itself didn't already cover. She'd been the one who'd gone quiet on the phone before I left, and I think some part of both of us understood, without needing to spell it out, that she'd been right to. I do not describe myself, when people ask how Thailand was, as destroyed, because I don't think that's honest. And I've noticed that men who describe themselves that way tend to stay stuck in the telling of it far longer than the ones who simply say, plainly, that it cost them a great deal, and they're now doing the work of rebuilding. My daughter has been patient with me in a way I don't think I entirely deserve, sitting through more than one evening of me turning the whole thing over aloud, trying to find the exact sentence that would make it make sense, and she has, more than once, gently pointed out that I don't actually need the sentence, that I'm allowed to have simply made a costly mistake while exhausted and grieving, without it needing to resolve into a tidy moral, before I'm allowed to move on from it. What I lost financially will take some years yet to properly recover from, if it ever fully does at 61. What I think I actually lost, though, and what I'm still working out how to rebuild, is the specific fantasy that a new country could do the work my own mind needed to do instead. That exhaustion, unexamined, simply follows you through customs like a piece of luggage nobody flags at security, and that the shape of your own vulnerability doesn't change just because the scenery around it does. If there's a lesson in any of this, and my daughter tells me I've now said some version of it to her about 6 times, it's that relief and recovery are not the same feeling, even though they can feel identical from the inside. I mistook relief, the simple, blessed absence of an old pain, for evidence that I'd actually healed from what caused it, and I built an entire relationship, an entire relocation, an entire fresh start, on top of that mistaken feeling, without ever checking whether the foundation underneath it was sound. 30 years in construction taught me never to build on ground I hadn't tested first. It took losing 206,000 pounds on a Thai island to teach me that the same rule applies to a life. I don't know if I'll try again, somewhere else, someday. But if I do, I know now that the first thing worth testing isn't the ground beneath a new country. It's the ground beneath the man standing on it.